Games Workshop have just revealed a massive update to Warhammer, something that will change the franchise forever. It could be amazing, or it could be really bad. Either way, things will never be the same. And I'm gonna be honest, most people that have talked to me about this think that it's really, really bad. I think some of them might have been frothing at the mouth a little. So obviously, some Warhammer fans in the community seem to think that the waters have risen to take us all down to a watery doom. But is it actually so ruinous? Well, today in the Discourse Corner, let's find out. Well, the unthinkable has happened. Games Workshop have finally revealed concrete information about how the new version of Warhammer is actually going to play. And it might not be what anyone was expecting at all. It certainly surprised me. In the article revealing the new information, Games Workshop have said that Warhammer the Old World is a new game, designed from the ground up to simulate large regiments meeting in combat as volleys of arrows and artillery shots soar overhead, and cavalry, wizards, heroes, and monsters crash into combat all around them. Okay, cool, there's a lot of fluff there, and there's also an implication that the new Warhammer game will be different from the original Warhammer Fantasy Battles of yesteryear. And this is actually pretty wild. It's a really big deal, because I think a lot of people were expecting the new version of Warhammer to just be, well, Warhammer again. Or at least I was expecting that. I genuinely thought that I'd basically be cracking open my old Warhammer Fantasy 7th edition rulebook and playing the exact same thing that I played all those years ago, back before I became embittered and filled with hate. But GW have revealed that no, actually, I'm a stupid bubble, because they're actually doing their job and thinking about how to make the game fun rather than just reproducing past work exactly as it was before. And that's great. This is an opportunity for them to re-examine what it is that people want from a fantasy Warhammer game focused on grand battles with armies and wizards and artillery, rather than a fantasy game mostly revolving around big monster go smash face like Age of Sigmar is. Okay, I'm exaggerating there. Please don't hurt me, Sigmar fans. I saw what you did to Zorpazorp. So this is genuinely the biggest opportunity Games Workshop have ever had to grab new people and get them into Warhammer Fantasy. And that's doubly important considering the Creative Assembly have basically been fluffing an increasingly growing audience of interested gamers for the last 7 years with Total War Warhammer. All of those millions of people now gasping, drooling, and eager for the old world's massive, bulging release. And Total War Warhammer fans do need somewhere to go these days now that Total War is apparently exploding. And even amongst the old school player base, GW has a little bit of a challenge ahead of them. They can't just walk into bed with those old school players either. A lot of those guys have moved on. Admittedly, a lot of them have moved on into a graveyard. But for those who still grace our Facebook pages, there's a lot of suitors vying for their attention these days. The gaming landscape looks way different compared to the heyday of Warhammer Fantasy back in 2007. For one, there's actually a lot of competition now when it comes to rank and flank and regimental war games. Off the top of my head, there's a Song of Ice and Fire, there's One Page Rules Age of Fantasy Regiments, Turnip 28, Oathmark, Conquest Last Argument of Kings, and of course, Kings of War. All of these are great games, and they do something really well in that genre. They are now well established. They're popular games that Games Workshop will now be competing with, especially Mantic Games and their Kings of War title. Kings of War, of course, being just basically Warhammer Fantasy Battles already, right down to the turn structure, but a better, more modern version. And it's filled with an audience of people who feel burned by GW dropping the Warhammer franchise in the 2010s. So yeah, starting from the very beginning, going back to the foundations and rebuilding an entirely new game, that's really smart. Modernizing it, learn some lessons, make some changes. Present a game that's new and improved, and honed in on capturing these two disparate marketplaces. New players, old players, damn, go get them, Games Workshop. Claim some creative landscape. Do some out-of-the-box, innovative thinking. Job's a good one. And when I read this new tell-all reveal article, I was really excited to see what they've done with this new creative landscape. I mean, considering the context that I've just laid out, Games Workshop wouldn't completely tear down the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle rules, start from a totally clean slate, and then redesign the game from the ground up just to make the exact same 40-year-old game that we had before. Would they? Spoiler, yes, of course they have. And it's basically a huge disaster, and I'm really worried that the old world is essentially dead on arrival as a result. Okay, so maybe I'm exaggerating a little. Games Workshop have changed some elements to the game. Instead of a game turn being structured around the old, very lame, far too slow-paced movement phase, magic phase, shooting phase, and close combat phase, like in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, PU. The old world has the new, very different, and far superior strategy phase, movement phase, shooting phase, and close combat phase. This is obviously very different? Okay, so maybe not that different. But the phases being similar is not even really the bad part here. Instead, the real issue is that they've kept this phase thing at all. Because what that reveals is that each player will be going through a phase all at once, controlling their entire army and then passing back control to the other player.
I'm sorry, Lord Bullingdon, but you must first stand your ground and allow Mr. Linden his turn to fire.
That's right. Warhammer the Old World is going to use you go, I go, and that basically kills this game. No one wants to say it, but I don't think that people who would be interested in Warhammer in 2023 want to sit for 45 minutes to an hour waiting for their opponent to take their turn before they even get to do anything. Recreating the game to reintroduce this broken turn system, this poorly paced mess, is utterly going to kill this game in infancy. Certainly, no Total War Warhammer players are going to play this game. Remember, they are the prospective diamond demographic that this game should really be flirting with. But those guys can't even sit through a 5-minute end turn screen. They will not be able to handle a single full turn sequence of this new Warhammer game. And yes, I get it, Warhammer Fantasy Battles used to be you go, I go, and Warhammer the Old World is trying to nostalgia bait all the old players of that game into the new game. Sure, so therefore they didn't want to change things too drastically. But there's only one problem there: the old school Warhammer Fantasy community just isn't big enough. I mean, the game got discontinued, and it was rumored that the entire fantasy line was being outsold by the Space Marine Tactical Squad back in the 2000s. And I count myself in that community of old school fans. Well, middle school in my case. I loved Warhammer Fantasy Battles, but I'm telling you right now that if that is the only group of people that this game appeals to, then it is dead. We need young blood. And I'm not just saying that because I play vampire accounts. The game would just be way better off with a more dynamic system, and this really was the time to do it. A spin-off game made like 10 years after the previous iteration was ended? That is when you get freaky with it. Instead, they've just mostly reiterated a game that, well, that failed before. And I say mostly reiterated, though there are some changes. And the worst part about that is that all the changes that they have listed seem kinda bad. It sounds like the game is actually worse than it was before. And I'm genuinely trying to keep an open mind here, but I'm just not impressed. So to give you an example, so they've rejigged all of the phases. Okay, sure, that seems to mostly be an exercise in renaming, but you know, there are some big reveals in the article. Like for example, they've now replaced the magic phase with the strategy phase. And I'm not against this because the magic phase wasn't really that great in the old Warhammer Fantasy games. It was pretty boring watching your opponent fiddle around with their wizards as they tried to cast biggest dickus on your general, especially if you yourself didn't have a wizard to contest them with. Now, the strategy phase has replaced it, and that's all about checking for victory points and using character special rules, like blowing a big horn. Okay, all good. But it's also the phase for casting magic. Yeah, what the heck? I thought that this wasn't the phase for magic. Well, psych, you do actually cast spells during the strategy phase. It's just that you only cast certain types of spells, enchantments and hex spells only, to be exact, which means that there's a whole load of other 10 million spells that don't get cast during the strategy phase, and instead they get cast at random times in the battle depending on the spell. The example that is given in the article is the Hand of Mork/Gork, and that gets cast during the movement phase because it's a conveyance spell. This means that rather than a magic phase where all of the spells are cast at once, there's now a strategy phase where you cast a lot of the magic all at once. And then you cast magic at other times too. It's basically the worst of all worlds. It doesn't address any problems with the magic phase. It just means that I'm going to need to remember when all of my spells are cast. Awesome. I love to have more stuff to remember in my Warhammer game. That's exactly what Warhammer was missing. Then, at the end of the strategy phase, you rally fleeing troops. You basically roll a leadership check for fleeing units, and if they fail, they continue to flee. Now, that is good, and I'm glad that they're keeping the classic morale system because that was actually fun. It's just that everything else around that sounds kind of spooky. So, score 1 on the win board then. Oh, it's not looking good for win. And that's all the information that they've revealed for now, but I just think that that's enough to be really worried about because honestly, what they have shown is the meat of the game, the foundations of the game, the design vision of the game, and there's a lot to be worried about there. To be frank, I just don't think it's going to cut it. I don't think that the old world is going to be able to compete. Rank and flank games are like the OG of miniature wargaming, all the way back to Riksspiel, but the reality is, it's an extremely unsexy style of game. To actually attract new people to it, you have to do something really special and give it a proper twist and a little bit of a killer app element. In A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, that game has an amazing IP mixed in with some awesome general cards and a politics sideboard alongside super fast gameplay, making it play like something closer to a skirmish game. You can genuinely get 1 hour long games out of that bad boy. For Conquest: Last Argument of Kings, it has a really interesting deployment system where all models start off the board and then your scouts and your fast units ride in first and they skirmish with your opponents, and then your main force kind of slowly trickles onto the board. It's very novel. For Oathmark, it has an entire base building system and super customization of your own duchy. I just don't see why someone would play Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer the Old World right now when those games exist, beyond just wanting to get the models and the IP and perhaps a brief nostalgia hit. And yeah, sure, arguably that is enough, but frankly, I expect more out of the biggest wargame company on the planet. I think that they should aspire to make the greatest games around, not just phone it in. And I am reserving judgment here. Don't take this as like the final indictment of the game. I really want to love this game, but damn am I worried about Warhammer Fantasy. This does look like it's just going to be a rehash of a game that went down the tube 10 years ago, and that really sucks. Nostalgia will lead to big sales of the starter box that they will release that will contain Bretonnia and Tomb Kings. I have no doubt about that, but it will not lead to a healthy, large gaming community. And without that, the game is dead in the water, which I do not want. I want to be able to play this game. I want it to be successful. I fucking love the setting, okay? I really want it to be good, but I'm really worried. And if you want to see my thoughts on some of the new models and how they also don't quite hit the mark, then check out this video here. And if you want to support my ability to create videos covering the old world and get back to you on whether or not it ends up being really good or really not, then check out my Patreon. There you can get bonus videos, live streams, and even hobby hangouts. There's a link in the description of this video. And a massive thanks to CryptoKev, Novany, and Travis Hunter. Thanks so much. I'll catch y'all next time. Bye-bye.